32, Madam Secretary.
House Bill 1332, a bill for an act to amend and reenact Section 16 of the North Dakota Century Code relating to eligibility to vote. The fiscal note indicates a loss of revenue of $245,000 from other funds for the 13-15 biennium.
Senator Dever.
Mr. President, when I went to vote in November, I went to the clerk and I handed her my driver's license and she scanned it and I was ready to go. It was simple, it was easy, and the integrity of my eligibility to vote was protected. Mr. President, if I did not have a driver's license to show them and they knew me, they could let me vote. And if they did not know me, they would execute what would be an affidavit process. What that would involve would they would fill out a form. Their ballot would have gone into the ballot box, and the affidavit would have gone to the county auditor. Following the election, the county auditor then would have 45 days to send a postcard to the address, and if the postcard came back as undeliverable, the state's attorney would know that they may have a fraudulent ballot. But at that point, the ballot would have been counted. Mr. President, in that election, there were 10,519 affidavits executed in the state of North Dakota. Of those, 379 of those postcards were returned as unverifiable. Some of those went to the state's attorney. I think about 9 or 10 are being prosecuted. House Bill 1332 then comes to us to eliminate the affidavit process to require a voter ID. So that process that I just described would no longer exist. If you come to the poll and you don't have a voter ID, then you don't vote. But Mr. President, most people have a driver's license, which is a valid ID. This bill provides that people who do not have a driver's license can get a state-issued non-driver's license identification at no cost. That's important. We've always allowed that at a cost of $8. Now we'll make that free because it will be used for that purpose. You could also get an ID from the Secretary of State, or we made provision in the bill for you to get an ID, a tribal ID that would allow you to vote as well. So, Mr. President, the bill eliminates affidavits. It provides for a driver's license state ID. On an absentee ballot application, if the voter does not have an ID, and on the absentee ballot application they would be asked to put the number of their ID. If they don't have one, then someone else who has one could still vouch for them and put their number on the application. So the ID would be free, and the bill, as we amended it, still allows people who have a driver's license, if they have a desire to get a non-driver's license ID, they can do that at a cost of $8. My mother, in the last 20 years of her life, was legally blind, and she never had a driver's license for that reason, but she had a state-issued ID. For the last 10 years of her life, she pushed a walker, but she never let that slow her down. So she served on multiple boards, but that ID was important to her for a lot of different purposes, not just for voting. So, Mr. President, some would suggest that this might limit access to the ballot. I would suggest that our allowing them to have that ID at no cost increases access to the ballot and most certainly protects the integrity of that ballot. And I think that's something that's important to all of us. So, Mr. President, your Committee on Government, Veterans Affairs, and the Appropriations Committee agrees that we should pass this bill, and we would ask the concurrence of the Senate.
Further discussion? Senator Schneider.
Mr. President, before we cast our votes on this bill, I just ask that we consider three things. Number one, the nature of the alleged problem that this bill seeks to address. whether this legislation actually addresses that perceived problem, and then finally the cost of passing this legislation, both in terms of dollars and cents and on the human cost to some of our most vulnerable populations here in the state. First, is there a problem with voter fraud in North Dakota? The public statements of our chief election officer give us a clue in terms of the answer to that question. Reading briefly from the publication put out by the Secretary of State entitled North Dakota, the only state without voter registration, this pamphlet asks, is voter fraud possible in North Dakota? Yes. Have there been incidents of widespread voter fraud in North Dakota? No. Does North Dakota have widespread problems with non-citizens voting? No. Now, Mr. President, there may be some who take issue with the qualifier widespread in those previous statements. Fair enough. Let's look precisely at how much voter fraud has actually occurred in this state. The Secretary of State just 2 months ago, and on the heels of a fiercely competitive U.S. Senate general election, said, quote, in his 20 years as Secretary of State, we have only had 1 or 2 or 3 cases we'd consider fraud, close quote. 1 or 2 or 3 in 20 years. But we can slice the pie even more thinly than that, Mr. President. Between 2000 and 2010, the total number of voter fraud cases prosecuted in North Dakota is a small number. In fact, it's barely a number at all. 1 case of voter fraud was prosecuted in North Dakota in 10 years. During these same 10 years, 2,259,312 ballots were cast in North Dakota. 1 person was prosecuted for fraud. Let's put that into a little bit of perspective. The odds of being struck by lightning in a given year, according to the National Weather Service, which is somewhat of an authority on the issue, are 1 in a million. The odds of voter fraud happening in a given decade in the state are 1 in 2,259,312. So, Mr. President, maybe you're thinking that the rate of actual voter fraud is higher than the rate of prosecutions for voter fraud. Again, fair enough. In that case, let's take a look at the allegations that my friend from Bismarck mentioned. He thought it was 9 or 10. It's actually 9. 9 out of 325,862 ballots that were cast last fall. I mean, you can pretty much name off 9 names. That's the rate of alleged voter fraud that occurred in arguably the most competitive election in North Dakota's history. Now, we all agree that voter fraud is a very bad thing. There's no question about that. But even if all of these cases are proved to be voter fraud, and even if all of the alleged cases of fraud occurred in the same legislative district, that alleged fraud would not have changed the outcome of one legislative race across the state. So in part because of this practically non-existent rate of voter fraud and the practically non-existent rate of voter fraud allegations, North Dakota was ranked number 1 amongst all 50 states by the Pew Charitable Trust when it comes to the election administration. This is in 2010. Mr. President, you can't do much better than number 1. So will this bill fix the problem? By any fair measure, there is no problem. But if you believe there is a problem, let's ask ourselves, will requiring voter ID fix this perceived problem? And so let's go back to those 9 allegations of voter fraud from the last election. Those suspected cases of fraud involve people who allegedly voted once by absentee and then another time at the polls. Mr. President, that person could vote at home, show up on election day, smile at the poll worker, show an ID, and vote again. This bill will have no impact on those 9 alleged cases of voter fraud that happened last election. So what's the cost? Mr. President, the dollar cost is readily apparent, a little over $200,000. But the cost to our senior citizens is even more than that. And so 18% of Americans, elderly Americans, can't get a photo ID, or don't have a photo ID, more accurately. Can they get them? You know, sure. But why should someone who's been voting in the same precinct for decades have to drive from Beach to Dickinson to get a photo ID to show to their neighbor who's working the polls? It makes absolutely no sense. Mr. President, this is part of a national partisan movement on voter ID. This body is bigger than that. Those charges just don't square with the scrupulously honest voters that we have in North Dakota. I would hope that we can reject this bill. It's misguided, and it doesn't serve a purpose in our state.
Senator Axness.
Mr. President, I have a question for the carrier. And the question is, in my district, I have a lot of college students, and with that, it comes a lot of apartments, and these students move sometimes every year. My question is, if that student doesn't have a driver's license and needs to get a state-purchased ID to vote, is there any limits as to how many times the state is going to purchase that ID for that student, or is it you get one and you're done? I'm just curious, because if they're moving every year and they're going to be voting at a different place, that could add up to a lot of state finances going to this voter ID.
Senator Dever, do you wish to answer the question?
Well, Mr. President, I was impressed with the minority leader in his homework. I always wondered what leaders did when the rest of us were in committee. And I'd like to thank the senator from District 16 because he brought up a point that I failed to address in the bill, and it's an important part, and it does point to a problem that is being fixed, and that is non-resident college students who don't have an ID. And what has happened is, working together with the university system, the Secretary of State and the sponsor of this bill looked at the software program that they have in their college programs and have worked out the ability for them to print out an affidavit of sorts that would demonstrate their eligibility to vote by including the address of their residence. And it's a simple process. It's a software program that college students use all the time. It doesn't create any complication for them, and it does assist in that process and protects the integrity of their ballots.
Senator Miller.
Mr. President, some of the numbers being thrown around here, I just wanted to bring a point. Different counties, I don't think this information gets reported perhaps to the Secretary of State, or maybe it just was never brought forward, but different counties have different procedures on how they count ballots and what qualifies a legal ballot. And for example, in the last primary election, I believe in my district, one county threw out about 30 different ballots because we do mostly vote by mail, and signatures didn't match. And so the county election board, whatever it's called, the certifying board there, they can set their own criteria for how they determine what is a proper ballot and what should be counted. So there's probably more ballots out there that are fraudulent, that are just simply not, that are getting cut out before we even get to an issue, and nobody's ever really tried to check to see why these ballots were being thrown out. I know we asked, or some people asked about, what are you doing to verify that these ballots are fraudulent or not, and they said, well, nobody is, they just threw them out. So that's something to munch on there too.
Senator Triplett.
Mr. President, I have a question for the carrier, and I think this is a fairly simple question, which is, does it matter if the driver's license is current, or is it okay to use a recently expired driver's license?
Senator Dever, do you wish to answer that question?
Mr. President, I don't recall that we had that specific conversation in committee. I think there was some reference, and the important thing is the ability to validate that. So I'm not real sure.
Senator City.
Mr. President, if you're ever involved in a close election, as I was, and ever go to read the poll books, it's really instructive. I lost an election by 50 votes, and so my running mate and I decided to go to a precinct. We went down to the county auditor's headquarters, and we decided to read the poll books just in one precinct. And we quit counting when we found 20 people who had voted in that election who did not live within those precinct boundaries. Now, in most cases, I'm not saying those are fraudulent votes. In most cases, I believe that the precinct boundaries had changed, or the people were misinformed, or in one way or another, the poll workers didn't catch that they lived outside of the precinct boundary. But we do know that these mistakes happen. And so I think this is a really great piece of legislation. It'll help all of us to ensure that people are voting in the right place.
Senator Triplett.
Mr. President, just to respond to the carrier regarding, or to the answer to my question, I should say, my concern is that with having to use driver's license or other ID cards, especially, given that driver's licenses do expire, and that there apparently is nothing in the bill that I could see, and he more or less verified that it's not there, in terms of a cutoff date. Some counties may interpret it narrowly and say that if you don't have a valid driver's license, then you can't vote, whereas others may interpret it more broadly, as I believe the TSA does when we fly, that if you have a driver's license that has expired within the previous year, they'll let you use it. So, I think there could be various interpretations which would actually increase the confusion about who is and who is not eligible to vote. So for that and the reasons expressed earlier here today, I would encourage a no vote on this bill.
Senator Dever.
Well, Mr. President, it is the responsibility of the voter to have their driver's license up to date. If they don't, I hope they didn't drive to the polls. But we do use non-driver voter IDs for multiple purposes, and the previous speaker mentioned flying. You can use it for that purpose. And I think a lot of the elderly people in our state are really kind of excited about this bill because they'll get an ID that won't cost them anything. Mr. President, regarding the integrity of the ballot, or is there a problem? I think we should ask ourselves, and I'm proud to be from North Dakota and to say that we don't have a big problem with voter fraud. But I think you have to ask yourself, do we have a small problem with voter fraud because the affidavit process works? Or is it because of the honesty and the integrity of the North Dakota citizens? And I think the second answer is the right answer, because we have respect for our process in North Dakota. So, Mr. President, even though the problem may be small now, we've grown in population by about 30 or 40,000 people since the last census. We've got a lot of new people coming in, a lot of different interests in elections. And I think the integrity of the ballot is improved by the passage of this bill.
Senator Nelson.
Mr. President, I live in a district that has got at least 3 nursing homes and a university. So I've got both ends of the spectrum here. We did a forum at one of the nursing homes. We asked how many people had IDs. Not many. Well, if you had to get them, would you have the materials to get them? Do you have a birth certificate? No. Or I don't know where it is. Could they use the medical records? They weren't sure. Those are private. They're considered to be private, but I'm sure they could be used for the person involved. But is that the true date that's on the medical record? Hard to tell. College students, yes, they did come in with a plan for them. But what's the problem here? I go back to the first time I voted, and I went to the polling place, and they had a shoebox with index cards in it. And our name was on the index card, and it had a complete record of when we had voted, and if we were new, we had a new card. And then you'd kind of look to see where are the new white cards, so you could tell how many new people voted that particular section. Now we're going to be so picky on these people. My heavens. We don't need this bill, and I think you should vote no.
Senator Warner.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. My district covers about 5,000 square miles, parts of 6 counties, not a single county seat. There are a lot of places in my district where you would have a 90-minute to 2-hour drive to the closest DMV, which may be open only one day a week or one day a month, during business hours, during the working week, never on Saturdays. I would guess half of the urban residents, and you have to realize my towns are pretty small, but very few of my towns actually have street names. Almost everybody receives their mail at a post office box in huge swaths of my area, in entire counties within my district. I don't think there would be a single street name. I can't imagine how you start overcoming all these obstacles. We have some pockets of extreme poverty in my district. I would guess no more than 1 in 4 or 5 adults has a car or a driver's license. If you need to get to somewhere, you have to find somebody that will drive you there for that occasion. And I don't really think we need to be creating more impediments to voting in North Dakota. This is part of a national movement. There may be a problem in other parts, but we're very proud of our people in North Dakota, and we don't need to be passing laws that we don't need.
Senator Andrist.
Mr. President, members of the Senate, I have a question for the carrier. I'm quite curious. You know, I come from that part of the state where perhaps a quarter or a third of the people there actually they're living there, but they wouldn't say they were living there. They probably live some other state. They have a driver's license in that state. We wondered how we could encourage more of them to vote, but concluded that probably it's pretty hard to do. Would this bill, how would this bill affect an out-of-state worker who had an out-of-state driver's license but was actually living in the state but didn't believe he was?
Senator Dever, do you wish to answer the question?
Mr. President, I happen to know, as the previous speaker says, that, or I happen to have come from the same part of the state, so I'm well familiar with the neighborhood. It is a requirement that when a person moves to North Dakota and gains employment, that they change their license plates to North Dakota plates and they change their driver's license to North Dakota driver's license. So I'm not sure why that should be a problem. Mr. President, there's another circumstance, and I think the DOT would be willing to work together to accommodate whatever is necessary to provide IDs to whoever. We have another circumstance in our state and where they're doing just that. People who are in the state penitentiary don't necessarily have identification. Approximately about half of them, as of a few years ago, did not. That's a real problem when they're released and they don't even have a birth certificate. So the Department of Corrections work together with them, work together with the DOT, and they're not taking them up to the DOT. The DOT's going out there. So, Mr. President, I think the DOT is willing to accommodate any of those kinds of circumstances, and we don't have registration in North Dakota. But if we did, each party would be working to do whatever they could to register voters in the name of their party. So I guess if I was in a remote area and I wanted to make sure that my voters were going to be able to vote, I'd make sure they had an ID. So I think this is an opportunity for the parties to advocate for their constituents, to possibly provide themselves an advantage by working harder than the other party to get that accomplished. So I don't see where that would be a negative.
Senator Schneider.
Well, Mr. President, much has been said, so I'll just briefly conclude. I completely agree with my friend from Bismarck who says that the success that we've had in administering elections, that's the result of the honesty and the integrity of the voters of North Dakota. But it's undeniable under this bill, Mr. President, that honest people of integrity, possibly thousands of them, who are creatures of habit, confused about the code's requirements for voting, or maybe just because they don't get around as well as they used to, those honest people of integrity are going to be turned away at the polls. That is the result of this legislation.
Further discussion? Senator Erbley.
Well, Mr. President, my district covers greater part of 6 counties, and it seems to me that if the vulnerable, the poor, are able to get to the poll, that sometime within that 2-year period when we have our election, they ought to be able to get somewhere to get a ID as well.
Any further discussion? Senator Grabinger.
Mr. President, it was mentioned earlier about the close races and how important it is. I had faith in our system before I was in an extremely close race 4 years ago. I lost by 8 votes. I had confidence in our system afterwards. I think the senator from District 10 did a fine job in saying that most of the problems are caught before it becomes a problem. We have a canvassing procedure and so forth, and I think he spelled it out and made the best defense of why we don't need this bill, and I would ask everybody to oppose it.
Any further discussion? Hearing none, the question is on the final passage of House Bill 1332. Would the Secretary please open the key? All senators have voted. Any senator wishing to change their vote? Secretary, close the key. Final tally on House Bill 1332 reveals there are 30 senators voting yea, 16 senators voting nay, 1 senator absent and not voting. The bill is passed. House Bill 13